Good day. I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 54, recorded on July 5th and released on July 18th, 2026. The title of this episode is Failure to Reproduce. The human race is failing to reproduce itself in most parts of the world today, and I want to talk about that in this episode and the next. But first of all, this is a prepping channel, helping to prepare you and your family line to flourish and thrive and reproduce in the coming era. We're ending an era of about 250 years during which the human race averaged across the whole world consumed twice as much of everything after each 22 years. So each generation had about twice as much as their parents did, and we've arrived at consuming about 60,000 calories per person per day. That's averaging across the whole world. Of that, most of it, 2/3 of it, 41,000 calories, is from coal, oil, and gas. Another 5,000 is from what we call renewables and nuclear, and 15,000 is from food, fodder, and wood. In the coming era, that will actually be reduced to somewhere around 30,000 calories per person per day. So a bit less, somewhere where the human race was around 1970. If you want to review the energy sources that we have at our disposal, how much pain and risk and so on goes into getting energy from each of those energy sources, and why we're not going to get more than 30,000 or so total from them, review the first section of this channel, which was up until episode 38. Now we're in the second section of the channel, which is about the transition from this era of doublings into the coming era when we won't be doubling anymore, and we'll be using a little bit less of everything, roughly half as much as we have now at our disposal. And we're winding up this second section about the transition. It's gone on from episode 39 until it'll wind up in episode 56 a couple weeks from now. Right now we're on episode 54. And the main themes of this second section of the channel's content are how to recognize the transition and where are we in it. So overall, the first two sections have been trying to get our head on straight about where we're coming from, where we are now, and just seeing things as they are. And in the third section, we'll be finally getting into the action part of prepping. What would you actually do differently in order to prepare yourself and your family for the coming era? So overall, we're wrapping up the second section about the transition right now, and in the last episode, episode 53, I finally told you where we are. And right now, we haven't run out of easy energy yet, easy coal, oil, and gas. We could, in theory, multiply our energy consumption by 2 one more time. It wouldn't last that long before the coal, oil, and gas, easy coal, oil, and gas ran out, and we'd suddenly find ourselves making very hard choices about whether to send armies underground or whether just to do with it a bit less. But we could, in theory, do it, and same thing with many other resources. There's still resources to consume. There's not much room for more doublings after the next doubling, so we aren't strictly at the end of our supplies, but nonetheless, we are in the midst of a collapse. If you look at our economic growth, for instance, it's certainly slower than it used to be worldwide, and worldwide we may not be growing at all. It's hard to tell. You can look at some of the episodes around 10 episodes ago about fake growth and about shell games to see more of that. And there's plenty of other things that our scientific progress and our human progress is not speeding up. If anything, it's slowing down. And what's really going on is that there are two basic problems. One is that humans are built, and our minds are built, our bodies are built, the way that we interact with each other is built, and the way that we interact with the world is built for a certain way of life that is plugged in to the biosphere, the world around us, via a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where we're on our feet all the time looking around and interacting and with big species, small species, and getting certain kinds of food. In fact, we're omnivores. We get everything. We eat everything, and naturally we eat a mix of it, and we're constantly working, in some sense, and challenged, and life is exciting this way, and instead we've moved more and more toward to a farming and pasturing lifestyle, more closed in, and more grain focused, more carb focused, and then to coal, oil, and gas, where more and more we're sitting or slouching on chairs and at desks, couches, and in completely motionless surroundings inside of buildings, and living in more and more luxury and very little physical challenge, and then finally toward a kind of energy delivery that that we have no previous experience with as a species. It's electricity, and electricity is able to do marvels for us that and to addict us in ways that we seem to be utterly defenseless against. So if you want to review, so at each stage of this walk, the penalties of taking the next step grow bigger and bigger. So per calorie, per 1,000 calories, the side effects and the consequences of consuming 1,000 calories of wood or of grain are less than the consequences of consuming 1,000 calories of coal, oil, and gas, and that's even less than the consequences of consuming 1,000 calories of renewables. So right now, so there's been a lot going into this discussion in previous episodes. You can look at ones about the true cost of renewables or about tuning. But anyway, that's the first big reason why we're slowing down is this continued push towards more and more burdensome ways of getting energy, and the second one is that we've been living in a glut of energy and a glut of other resources for a long time now, and our personalities and our families and our societies have come apart at the seams. We just don't know how to handle this kind of affluence, and therefore the human race is just falling apart. And you can look at the previous episode 53 for more about that. Okay, so even though we are not yet running out of the easy coal, oil, and gas, we're getting close to that. We're already running we've already arrived at our limits, and we're already in the late stages of a collapse individually and as a society and as a world, and no longer, and we're descending into chaos, and we're, things, very elementary things like we're on the way to most of us no longer being literate. There's no need to be literate anymore in a world that's based on video and interactions rather than communication. So this episode is following up that story, that summary of where we are. We're in the midst of collapse, systemic collapse from apparently very many different causes, death by 1,000 cuts, but the origins are in this glut of energy and in this continual progress away from I'm not saying we should go back to being hunters and gatherers. I'm just saying we should be very careful about deciding what we should change. And so far, we've just taken every change as far as we could. So I have to be a lot more thoughtful, a lot more careful about the changes that we make compared to where we were as hunters and gatherers, and how we want to live. And that'll be a lot of the material of the third section of this channel. Will be how to flourish, thrive, and reproduce in the coming era, where we'll still have a lot of energy, just not quite as much as we have today. Okay, and what to do with that. Okay. In this episode, I want to talk about one particular huge failure that's going on right now. It's part of the collapse, and it is perhaps the single most striking part of the collapse. It's the fact that our human race has lost its ability to reproduce itself in most parts of the world since 1970, so the last 55 years. And this is remarkable. The only way that a species goes extinct actually is if it fails to reproduce itself. We're on the way to extinction, and that's just what it is. We're failing to reproduce. And it's an elementary. Every species is programmed to spend the bulk of its energy on reproducing, on setting things up for it, and producing and gathering enough roots and energy and so on that it can make 1 million seeds, or make just 2 or 3 depending on its strategy, and distribute, and those will get to a good environment where they can grow, and everything's focused on this from a certain. If you analyze any particular species, how it's built, everything leads up to that and comes out of it, reproduction, and somehow we can't even get the most basic of human functions right anymore. So this current episode will be about where we are and what's happened over the last couple hundred years that have led up to this point. It can teach something about the reasons for our failure to reproduce. And in the next episode, we'll analyze why we're failing to reproduce. And I'll give you a final reason why we're failing to reproduce. Okay. And then the following episode after that, 2 weeks from now, will be just summing up this second section of the content about the current transition that we're in into the new era. Okay. So where are we now? Okay. First of all, you have to know that there's, in order for the human race to reproduce itself, every woman on average should have 2.1 children, roughly, maybe a little more. Okay. So where does this number come from? Well, only a woman gives birth and has children. Not the man, of course, has an important role in it, but he's not actually bearing children. So that means the woman has to bear a child for herself, to replace herself and the man. And then some of the children don't live to adulthood, so whether because because they're sick, or they die, or because of war, or any number of other reasons. So in an affluent country that's not at war, typically you need a little more than 2. You need 2.1 roughly children per woman. In a country that is at war, or that is not so affluent, or where disaster strikes, you may need quite a bit more than that, but the baseline is 2.1. Okay. If you have 2.1, that means that the next generation will have about the same number of people in it as this generation, and it will keep going that way as long as you keep having 2.1. If you have more than 2.1, then the next generation will have more children, more people in it. If you have less than 2.1, it will have less. Okay. As of 2023, the world's fertility rate is 2.31, so just above 2.1. So we're doing slightly more than replacement. Okay, that's the world as a whole, but that masks the fact that the large majority of the world's countries are far lower than 2.1, far lower than replacement, and that over the last 55 years, almost all of the world's countries have had their fertility rates plummeting. That means less and less and less children each year. And continuing to plummet, so that by now many countries are reaching 1 child per woman. So that means if you have a fertility rate of 1 child per woman, that means that the next generation will have about half as many people in it as the current generation. And in fact, the leader of the pack is actually the country that I live in, is South Korea. It's 0.75 children per woman as of 2026, I think, or 2025. So that means roughly the next generation will have 1/3 the number of people in it as the current generation. Okay. Some of the countries where this division by 2 is happening, roughly division by 2 generation by generation, are Italy, Spain, Greece, Finland, Japan, the Ukraine. That was before the special military operation began some years ago. I'm sure things are going much worse for Ukraine now than countries Thailand, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and others. So there are quite a few countries, including very important countries and countries with huge populations, like China, that are dividing by 2. By the way, I forgot. I want to add this in. There is some uncertainty about the reported fertility rates in various countries and the reported numbers of children. There's continuing speculation by many parties that China has less people, significantly less people than they claim, that they miscounted by enormous numbers, hundreds of millions. I'm not going to get into that at all here. I'm going to use the official United Nations numbers, which I assume are based on China's reports. So China may be failing to reproduce even worse than what I say. Okay, and there may be similar uncertainties for many other countries. Okay. Now there have been in certain countries, like in Europe, there have been concern about low fertility rates and for 30 or more years, and there have been lots of legislation and lots of other efforts to motivate citizens to have more children. Some of the places where this has happened has been Europe, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and Australia, and South Korea. And despite all sorts of concern, all sorts of public discussion, and lots of legislation, all sorts of perks given to people who choose to have a second or a third child, often these measures don't produce even a small increase in the fertility rate, and if they do slow down the decrease, they don't decrease it by much. And it does seem like, at least in Europe and perhaps in other countries, that whatever effect that these measures were having peaked around 2009, and then the fertility rates resumed their fall. But anyway, they're all failures, because none of them, there's no country so far that dipped, where the population, where the fertility rate went significantly below replacement, okay, where it was below 2.1 for 20 years, and then no country where it went below 2.1 for 20 years has ever yet recovered and gone above replacement rate. It just stays low, and they continue to not replace themselves, and then probably decreases yet more. So it doesn't matter. The South Korean government could offer every family $50,000 per child. It wouldn't matter. As things are right now, many of the young people don't even want to live with somebody else, much less marry anyone else, much less have children. Much less have one child, and then 2 children, and 3 children. It just doesn't, there's nothing to do. So for instance, the Netherlands is one of the countries that had the most success with this sort of thing. They had their fertility rate was 1.6 in 1980, so a bit below 2.1, and they managed to get it up to 1.79, still considerably below replacement, in 2010, 30 years later. And then in 2023 it's back down to 1.64, which is roughly where it was 40 years earlier. Germany was at 1.38 in 2000. It's at 1.53 in 2023, almost unchanged, still well below replacement, and who knows how many of that is because of the immigrant Muslims. There was one country that dipped very very quickly below replacement. It was Kazakhstan. They were at 2.83, well above replacement in 1990. For whatever reason, I don't know the history of Kazakhstan. In 2000, they dipped down to 1.95. So that's slightly below replacement. And then in 2010, they were back up at 2.59, well above replacement, and it went up again to 3.02 in 2023. So whatever happened there, they quickly recovered. It was a blip. I don't know what the blip was for them. Could it have been something about the disintegration of the USSR? I don't know. But anyway, there's no evidence at all, at least not since 1950, that any country can go under replacement rate, stay there for any substantial amount of time, and recover. There's none at all. The evidence so far is consistent with you go below replacement, you stay below replacement, and probably you continue to go deeper and deeper below replacement, as so many countries have, down to 1 per child or less, until, you just go faster and faster towards extinction. And there are very powerful reasons for that. People basically forget how to they restructure their societies and their careers, their futures, their relationships in a way that doesn't, and they have no idea how to walk it back from these ways of structuring our societies and our schools, our careers, our families, or better yet, dissolving our families and our societies. So I commented that it would, you could offer everyone $50,000 a child, and the fact is, it just doesn't occur to people to make the basic choices you would need to make to have more children. It's more of a theoretical possibility, and all the ingredients that would go into actually building a larger family and making that work. Those are things that if people have forgotten, it hasn't been passed on from generation to generation, and people have forgotten. So it's just very hard to recover once a society has forgotten how to do things. So there are 2 ways. I wanted to discuss 2 different kinds of countries because that have 2 very different histories for how their reproduction rates plummeted. But first I want to say that if you took, say, up until 1700 or 1800, before this, anyway, if you gave the country plenty of food, no war or limited war, and basic health care, these countries that were until 1700, all of us were living mostly on the land and off of the land. I mean, getting our energy from the land and our resources from the land. You give a country like that plenty of food, you give it adequate health care, I mean basic health care, I don't mean CT scans, and you give it, you know, and you make sure it's not in total war, and that country with adequate food and so on will tend to have around 7 children per mother. That's the fertility rate. I think that if without the food, the health care, and with the war, you'd probably still have 7 or 10 children per mother, but most of them would die in their youth, and so you'd have a lower fertility rate overall if you're counting the number that live till adulthood. Okay, but once you supply adequate food, basic social order, and some basic medicine, the birth rate, the number that live to adulthood skyrockets to somewhere around 7. Because that's the reason why I say that is because that's where the United States was in 1800. France was also somewhere up there around 1800, and that's where most other countries, all the world's poor countries, which was almost all of the world's countries, were in 1970. So I'll talk about 2 kinds of countries. There's the countries that are rich, and there are the countries that are not rich. Okay, and by rich I mean that the total income, the GDP per person, is $12,000 per person per year, averaged over that country. That's the rich, and then not rich is ones with 12,000 or less. Okay, now there's a whole spectrum of richness. Okay, the world's poorest country, so from 12,000, and there's, well, the United States is among the super rich, the ultra rich. It's $76,000 per person per year. Okay, so I have, and I'm going to break things into tiers. So there's the first tier would be 24,000 or more. That's the rich, the very rich. Okay, then there's an ultra rich, would be the United States at 48,000 or more, a few other small countries. Then there would be the rich, which would be 12,000 or more. Okay, and then there's everybody else, which is still much of the world at less than 12,000 GDP per person per year. Okay, and then that goes down in tiers, though. There are many countries that make between 12,000 and 6,000. There's another tier that makes between 6,000 and 3,000 per person, another tier between 3,000 and 1,500 per person, another tier between 1,500 and $750 per person, and there are countries that make even less per person. So the overall spectrum, just looking at countries, is a factor of 100. The poorest countries have 1/100th of the income per person of the United States. So you have to break it up into this tier system, which is divisions by 2. It's a huge difference. Okay, so when I'm talking about poor countries, I mean poor in a way that's spectacularly poor compared to the rich countries. Okay, they're spread all the way down to 500 per person, and there's all sorts of levels in between 500 and 12,000. And then there are the countries that are above 12,000, and there's a glass ceiling. Okay, people talk about progress, but the fact is that in general, except for a very few exceptions, there hasn't, over the last since 1970 in particular, but over the last century, there actually hasn't been there haven't been many countries at all that moved much along that spectrum of tiers up into the upper spectrum. Okay, the rich countries. the rich countries are still pretty much the same as they were 100 years ago, okay, or 200. There have been a few changes, and among those changes are some of the oil countries, and in particular in the last 50 years, China and South Korea. That's it. South Korea, China, and some poor countries, some oil countries. So let's talk about the rich countries, and I'm saying that we don't have to think much about whether we mean rich in 1970 or we mean rich now or we mean rich 200 years ago. The rich countries have remained rich, and the poor countries have been far down the totem pole. Okay. Now the rich countries. So let's talk about the United States in particular. The United States population, its fertility rate in 1800 was 7 children per mother. Okay, that's because the United States had entered into an era of affluence. It was expanding into a rich. The population was marching westward and had plentiful land, and they were entering an age of entering into the Industrial Revolution, and it was a land of opportunity, and they had everything they needed to have lots of children and to feed them, and so they did. That was in 1800, but already in 1800, at that point, the fertility rate was decreasing. So in 1840, the fertility rate was not 7, it was 6. In 1860, it was 5. In 1890, it was 4. In 1920, it was 3 children per mother. And in 1940, it was at replacement, it was 2.2. So already from 1800 to 1940, America was on a trajectory towards replacement rate and actually past replacement rate. Okay, because already in 1940 it arrived at replacement. Okay, it had reduced its fertility rate from 7 to 2.2. France also was on a similar trajectory. From 1800 to 1920, its population growth rate was decreasing again. Okay. And for the United States, then there was, after World War II, there was what's called the baby boom. Okay. So from 1945 until 1970, there was a small uptick. It didn't seem small to the people at the time, but compared to 7, it was still small. It probably went up to 3 or so, from 2.2 to 3. All that was over by 1970. In 1970, the fertility rate was down to 2.39 again. And in 1980, the United States crossed over to 1.75. It was below replacement in 1980. This is Caucasians, okay, white people, but the rest, all other ethnic minorities and nationalities, immigrants into the U.S. followed the Caucasians pretty closely within a couple decades. They're at the same rates. Okay, so it's representative of the entire United States population. So from 1980 onwards, the U.S. has been below replacement. As of 2023, it's 1.65. So it's not going for broke as quickly as South Korea is, but it's still continuing to descend. Now, you have to bear in mind that a decrease in fertility, a low fertility rate, does not necessarily mean that immediately the population is going to decrease the same year that the fertility rate decreases. It gets smaller, okay, because people live a certain amount of time. In fact, from 1970 until 2020, the U.S. population went from 210 to 330 million, so it multiplied by 1.5, okay? And that's because, well, first of all, there were lots of people who were born before 1970 who continued to live and to just age, okay? And so the U.S. population was getting older and older. Also, there were a lot of migrants, in particular 40 million legal migrants and who knows how many illegal migrants. Okay. The reason why I'm telling you this story is because it's clear that whatever causes our decreasing fertility rate was already in play in 1800 in the United States and in France. Okay. Now for other rich countries like the UK, I think the UK poor, there was an aristocracy which was very well off, and they had their fertility rate went down quickly, but the poor stayed in very poor conditions for some time, and so the fertility rate of the poor didn't start to decrease until somewhere around 1880. In 1880, their fertility rate was 5. In 1930, it was 2. It was around replacement. In Germany, the fertility rate in 1900 was 5, and it came down near replacement around 1930. In Japan was a bit later. Their fertility rate was at 5 in 1930, and it came down to replacement around 1965. So by 1970, all the world's rich countries, and that means, well, I'll spell it out. The upper tier, the richest tier is North America, excepting maybe Mexico, and Europe, and some countries in the Pacific, Japan and New Zealand and Australia. Okay, and then there are new entries since 1970 of China and South Korea. Okay, all those rich. Those are the very rich countries, and then there's a second tier of those are the countries with 24,000 or more. Oh yeah, and I forgot some of the oil countries. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and then Israel, and the Emirates, and didn't mention Singapore, Lithuania, Slovenia, Estonia, and Czech Republic. All these countries have 24,000 or more per person today. And all of those countries were, except for the oil countries in the Middle East, all of those countries had replacement rates generally around, their fertility rates were generally around replacement, between 1.92, that was the lowest, and 3. And the Middle East, those rich oil countries were still around 7 in 1970, but everyone else was generally around replacement. And now in 2020, all of them are below replacement except for Israel. Israel's at 3.03, and Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait are somewhere between 2.14 and 2.68. Okay, so all the rich countries in 1970 were at replacement roughly, and all of them now are substantially below, except for a very few oil countries. If you take Europe and North America together, averaging them together, bearing in mind that Europe has a substantially lower fertility rate than the United States, then and Canada, then the total North America and Europe is the fertility rate is 1.5 per mother. Then we have a second tier of rich countries between 12,000 and 24,000. That includes Greece, Russia, and 8 of the countries that used to be in the Warsaw Pact. Also 7 of the richest countries in Central America and South America: Panama, Venezuela, Guyana, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. Okay, and these countries, well, the Warsaw Pact countries were already close to replacement. Okay, but now they're substantially below. And the countries in South America and Central America that I just listed, they were somewhere up around 5, some of them, per children per mother, and they divided their fertility rates by 2 or by 1.5, and many of them are far below replacement. Okay, so in general, in 1970, these rich and very rich countries, any ones that have an income today of 12,000 or more, were well, the richest countries were at replacement, some of the slightly less rich countries were a bit above replacement, but by now most of them are considerably below replacement. The two exceptions are Israel and Kazakhstan, both of which are still slightly above 3. So that's the story of the rich part of the world. Okay, and then there's the rest of the world. Okay, and the rest of the world in 1970. Now they had a much different history. They had not enjoyed the Industrial Revolution and the continuing amassing of wealth that the rich countries had enjoyed, and they were still living mostly on the land. But after 1945, there was a globalization beginning, and there was also something called the Green Revolution, where fertilizer and other techniques allowed these countries to get more grain from their cropland, and so for a while they had plenty of food, and also medical care, basic medical care, was diffusing around the world, and there wasn't so much war in many of these places, and almost every country in the world outside of the richer countries had fertility rates of 5 or 6 or 7 children per mother. Okay, that was in 1970, and since then most of them have divided their in a few decades they've divided their fertility rates by very large numbers. So China and South Korea divided their fertility rates by 5. Okay, China was at 6.09 children per mother in 1970. Okay, now it's 1/5 of that. Okay, and it's just barely in my tier scheme of richness. It's just barely entered the tier of rich countries. It's $13,000 per person. Compare that to the United States is $76,000 per person. Okay, then there's South Korea. In 1970, its fertility rate was 4.9, about 5 per mother, and it has divided by. It's now at 0.75. Okay, so I guess it's divided by 7 by now, and its fertility, its income right now is 33,000 per person. Okay, so these were the success stories economically. Where these were the two that broke the glass ceiling and actually moved into the rich tiers. We'll see how long China lasts in the rich tiers at this rate, because it's just marginal. But it certainly moved upwards. But many other countries also divided their fertility rates by 4. For instance, Jamaica and Thailand, which Jamaica's fertility rate is 1.36 now, and Thailand's is 1.34, something like that. Okay, and they got a much smaller return. They're now at 7,000 per person, which puts them in the 3rd tier. Bhutan and Iran divided by 4 also, and their income is now at 4,000 per person. I don't know about after the recent wars between the United States and Iran, but as of a couple years ago, it was 4,000 per person. So that would put them in the 4th tier. Still a factor of 15 less per person, or 14 less per person. 4,076 divided by 4. 18, factor of 18, smaller than the United States in terms of income. So they didn't move up very much. Okay, so most of the world, almost all of the world's countries had population growth rates drop by numbers, divide by numbers between 2 and 3, and most of the world is now below replacement. And simultaneously, most of the world didn't see that much of an economic growth. They didn't move through the glass ceiling. They didn't move very much up the tier system either. Okay, they didn't get that much richer. They stayed poor. Okay. India and Bangladesh together, that's 1.6 billion people. They divided their fertility rate by 3. and they're still in the fifth tier. The fifth tier, I'll remind you, what was it? The fifth tier is it's between $3,000 and $1,500 per person. That's India and Bangladesh. Okay. So India's population growth rate is now 1.9. That's its fertility rate. Okay. So all of these countries made immense sacrifices, complete changes in culture and in lifestyle and in family, and they got precious little economic benefit from it. They just didn't see much improvement at all, even though they just transformed everything. They gave away their family structure and every bit of their culture, and they got nothing. So there are two exceptions, though, worldwide, two regions where this didn't occur yet. One is a region of the stands, okay? It's a region that's bordered by India, China, Russia, and Iran. Sometimes it's called Southwestern Asia. I'll name the 7 countries: Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Okay, 360 million people total. 2/3 of those are in Pakistan, and they are still having on average somewhere around 5 children per woman. And then somehow, roughly in nearby places, there are a number of countries with 3 children per woman: Palestine, Israel, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Okay, somehow they're sort of riding on the coattails, or maybe maybe this has something to do with the way that the stands are maintaining at 5. Okay, who knows? Okay. And there's a second exception, which is a much more important exception overall. It's Africa south of the Sahara and north of South Africa. So there's this. So you subtract South Africa and its neighbors. You subtract the countries on the Mediterranean north of the Sahara, and you get this huge band of. Sometimes people forget how huge Africa is, but if you take Africa as a whole, it's far larger than North America. Then even if you subtract out the northern bit along the Mediterranean and the southern bit around South Africa, you still have an enormous territory. It's competitive in size with North America and with Asia. Okay, and it's almost all fertile. Okay, land. So it's not densely packed yet, except for in a few places. In many places, it's rather sparsely populated compared to other places. And in this band, in general, the birth rates are still at 4.4 children per mother or higher, and in some places it's 6 or higher. Okay, this place has around a billion people today, and it's multiplying. Okay, it's multiplying with 4.4 and higher. That means it's doubling its population every generation. The population of Nigeria, which is the biggest country in the area and also an economic powerhouse by African standards, its population is today somewhere around a little more than 240 million people. Okay, and it's having children at a rate of 5.3 children per mother. Okay, and half of the people there are 19 years old or younger. So it's really going for broke. This whole area is. There's a billion people here. If they keep going this way, in 25 years there'll be 2 billion, and in 50 years there'll be 4 billion. And Nigeria itself is pretty packed, but this area has a lot of space. So it's not like you're destined to automatically have, societal breakdown. It's not guaranteed at all. There's plenty of farmland. So now some of these countries, I said that the countries that divided their fertility rates haven't seen much benefit. You can see a little bit of a signal, perhaps, of high fertility rates causing a bit more poverty in some of these African countries. Okay, but it depends on whether you count the amount of income per person, or you count the amount of income per parent or per family. Okay, if you were to look at the income per person, then you could think that some of these African countries have a bit less income per person than they might, okay, if they had divided their population growth rate. But if you look at the income per parent, and remember that every parent now has like four children, okay, they're actually there's no clear signal at all. Okay, it's the difference here is small. Let me say this in a little different way. Okay, so as I've said, in general, you look at these countries that have divided their fertility rates by 4, like India or Iran, and well, let's see, India divided by 3, India and Bangladesh, or Iran by 4, and Bhutan by 4, Thailand by 4. You look at these countries and you look at their GDPs now, and you think, okay, well, they didn't move that far up. Okay, Thailand, 7,000 per person is, well, I'm sure it's better than 2, but it's still a long shot from European or North American levels. Okay, and you look at India, and it's still down at 2,400 per person. Okay, and you think, okay, how much worse could it have been? Okay, because in Africa right now, the only countries that are below 750 or so, that would be the 7th tier, okay, are ones basically that have had something awful, the worst kind of war, okay, for 10 or 20 years, and then they're below, especially below 5, it just doesn't happen. So you look at that and you think, okay, how much worse could India have turned out if it had kept its population fertility rate a little higher? I don't know, but not that much worse. And because, but there is something noticeable, that the countries that are in the 6th tier, that's between 1,500 and 750 per person, and in the countries that are in the 7th tier, below 750, are almost all in Africa. So you look at that pattern and you say, well, maybe these countries could, maybe instead of being in the 6th tier, they would be in the 5th tier, or maybe instead of being in the 7th tier, they would be in the 6th tier. Maybe they would have twice as much income per person if they weren't having babies so quickly. Okay, so we're looking at a factor of 2, roughly, maybe 3, I don't know, in income multiplication if they had divided their population growth rate by 3. Okay, but even then it's not sure, because, for instance, Nigeria's population, its fertility rate is 5.3 right now, and its income per person is 2,200. You compare that to India, which its population growth rate is 1.9, and its income per person is just about the same as Nigeria's. It's 2,400. Okay, so you compare these two countries, and you think, okay, well, again, what does that 1.9 fertility rate give India? Okay, in terms of income, I don't know. Probably something, but I don't know. But it's not a factor of 2. It didn't put in. There's a lot of talk about powerful India and so on, but clearly these countries down in the 4th, 5th, and 6th tiers are not on a trajectory towards breaking through the glass ceiling. Okay, they haven't done it yet, and they're not on a trajectory to do it. Okay, they're still somewhere down in the lower tiers, far down. So controlling population, controlling fertility did not buy these countries a pass towards even moderate wealth, or anything like moderate wealth. They stayed where they were pretty much, within a factor of 2, factor of 3. And then you think, okay, you look at Nigeria, okay, for instance, or any of these countries in Africa, and you think, okay, well, maybe they could be 2 or 3 times richer per person if they had less children, okay? But then you realize how many less children, okay? And you realize that they'd have a third or a half or a quarter as many children, okay? So the total amount of wealth would be the same, okay? It's not, and if you look at parents, okay? The parents, if the parent counts his children, the income per child as part of his own income, okay? In other words, a parent has to help, especially if you have these families where these countries where half of the people are 19 years old or younger. What's happening there is the parents are sharing their wealth among their children, okay? So it's natural to think, okay, well, this parent could have had 7 children, has had 7 children, and is sharing his wealth among them, or that parent could have had 2 and would be sharing his wealth among those 2, okay? And you think, okay, well, if he had 2, suppose they had all had 2, all the families that had 2 children, maybe Nigeria's income per person would be twice as big, okay? Per child would be twice as big, okay? But per parent, it would be smaller, okay, even. What I'm saying is, what's going on here is not a change in the country's economy. The economic size of the country is not, even in these countries that seem rather poor per person, the country's economy is not markedly smaller because it's having more children. It's just dividing its wealth among the children. Okay? And in fact, that's what's going on in these countries. In Africa and I'm sure in the stands, what's going on is a deliberate choice to value children over cash, okay? That they think that taking I don't know, $20,000 and sharing it among 7 children is a better long-term choice and short-term choice than taking those $20,000 and sharing it among 2, okay? Better for the family, better for everyone concerned. In any case, this choice to have less children did not put any country on a development track, except for maybe on a track towards breaking the glass ceiling, except for maybe China and South Korea, and we'll see how long they last now. They're busy extinguishing themselves. So I'll end by discussing this is the facts of where things are. I'll discuss 3 scenarios for our future. Okay. Oh, one more note about farmland in Africa. If Africa were to double and redouble its population from 1 billion, this is the bit I'm leaving out, the few hundred million in the northern coast and in the southern tip. Okay. The billion that are in the center, if they were to double their population and redouble it as they're on track to do, to 4 billion, okay, I told you there's plenty of land, plenty of fertile land, okay, but it's not the most fertile land in the world. Much of that is in North America, in the Great Plains, okay, and certain other places. So this is not the most fertile land, and right now it's not producing that well. Part of that is because the Africans are not irrigating their land much at all, and also they aren't using chemical fertilizer much at all. There's still lots of most of them are still working on the land, getting what they can from it, but certainly there's lots of room for getting more. Okay, and they would have to do that if they were to multiply their population to 2 and to 4 billion. They would have to figure out how to get good harvests from their land. Right now, their land is not giving nearly as good a harvest as it could. Okay, but it's quite doable. The world knows how to do it. So now I want to wind up by discussing 3 scenarios for the future of the world's population and the way things could go. Okay, one scenario is, and all of these, we don't know the future, right? So there's nothing. This is all just scenarios. But this is some effort to think through the way things could go. Okay, it doesn't look like we're on track to suddenly reversing our fertility rates and making them be above replacement. There's no evidence that any country that has gone below for any substantial amount of time will ever recover. Maybe that'll happen someday. I don't know. Okay. But let's suggest this. Let's just look at a scenario where our fertility rates don't change, where every country's fertility rate stays the same as it is today and stays that way indefinitely. Okay. Well, right now, the world's population is increasing. Well, I don't know, up until say 2003. For the previous 30, 40 years, the world's population had been increasing by about 80 million per year. It was not on exponential growth. It wasn't multiplying by some percentage every year. Instead, it was adding 80 million every year, pretty consistently year to year. And the reason why that was going on, even though our fertility rate was sinking, was that people were getting older and older and older, okay, around the world. And what will happen soon is that I remind you, I'm talking about this scenario where the fertility rates don't change. What will happen soon is that the number of people added to the world population will decrease and decrease and decrease. It will still be a positive number because right now our fertility rate is still slightly above replacement, okay, but it will decrease and decrease below 80 down to 70 to 60 to 50 because more and more of the old people are dying now. Okay, so still a net slow increase in the world's population, but not the 80 million per year that it has been. Not nearly. But that makes it sound more peaceful than it will be. In fact, there will be immense things happening. There will be countries disappearing. Okay, the first to disappear will be South Korea, China, Japan, Thailand, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia. Okay, their populations are just plummeting. They're disappearing. Okay. When I say, I don't mean that the land will disappear, I mean that the people will disappear, and who knows what will happen after that. I will have some speculations about that in an episode, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 episodes from now. I'll have some speculations about the future of the world's population, what will happen when these countries lose their population, their native populations. What will happen then? Okay, but all we can say is that if the fertility rates continue as they are now, these populations won't exist anymore. The South Korea will no longer be South Koreans. It'll be an empty place, or else there will be other people living here. Okay. Well, I do have some I'll share with you one speculation, and then next after that will be the population. The next ones to disappear after those countries will be North America, Brazil, Australia, Iran, and Northern Europe. Okay. Now, one speculation is that if the fertility rates continue as they are, then there will be billions of extra people from Africa ready to move into Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Okay, and they can. And they'll be needed by what's left of those populations to do basic work and services. If the Africans are willing to perform those services, then they'll be needed. I don't know how to maintain a social order while this is going on, but anyway, they'll be needed, and even if they aren't needed, they'll have, fresh young energy ready to buy or bargain or force their way into situations and places. So I don't know how that will work, but there's kind of squatters' rights. When a house is empty, it's natural that somebody else will move in. Okay, so that's the first scenario where our fertility rates stay as they are. The second scenario is where our fertility rates continue along the trends that they've been following. So where there are continued decreases of fertility. For instance, India divided between 1970 and present, they divided their fertility by almost 3, 2.74. Now they're below replacement. And to say, okay, right now they're at 1.9, I think. And then if they were to continue to decrease their fertility. I'll take a break here. I'll be right back. So what I was saying was that India's been decreasing its fertility rate, and it looks like it's on track to continue decreasing its fertility rate it's already below replacement, so it might be headed for 1 or lower. Okay, same as China and South Korea. And so if you say, okay, all the countries that have decreased their fertility rates will keep on decreasing their fertility rates, and then you say that, okay, the only places where it won't decrease, it will be the stands and Israel and Africa. They'll maintain their fertility rates. Okay. Then what we'll have is a situation where instead of India maintaining a 1.9 fertility rate, it'll go for broke and go down towards 1. And many other countries like that will just continue. Ones that are at 1 will go for 0.75. Ones that are at 0.75 will go for 0.2. One child for every 10 parents and potential parents and things like that. And in this scenario, okay, then what you have is an even faster collapse of these countries that aren't having children. Okay, even more of a vacuum, and the Africans take over even more thoroughly and more quickly. Okay. So then a third scenario, okay, is one where finally the stands in Israel and Africa give way, and finally their fertility rates go below replacement. Okay, so they give up the fight too, and now everybody in the world is below replacement. Okay, all countries are shrinking. The world population as a whole begins shrinking, and as soon as the old people get old enough to die off, then say 60 years from now, the world's population meets its limit and begins to decrease and divide. Okay. So nonetheless, in this scenario, the Africans have stood up the longest, okay, and with the highest fertility rates. And so they'll still probably end up being half of the world's population, okay, or more. And they're still set to spread across the world, okay, even if their population is decreasing, still the other countries will decrease much quicker, and the Africans will still be set. Okay. So this is where we are. I have many ideas about, the next episode will be about why we're failing to reproduce. And then, as you know, this is a prepping channel about how to flourish, thrive, and reproduce in the coming era. If you know why we're failing to reproduce, and if you know how that has to do with the era that we're living in, then you can begin to think about, okay, how could we, at least maybe not for whole countries, but for individual families, and then for societies and groups, towns that those families build together, how could those groupings reproduce? And I think I'm not too worried about sooner or later there being a way forward for the world's population. But it will certainly involve a revolution, and what I've sketched here is these three scenarios where, large sections of the world's population, many of the world's countries, essentially go away, just disappear on their own, of their own choice. Not consciously thinking about it, maybe, but making all the choices every step of the way, from when you're born to every step of your education, of your family life, of your career, all of it oriented towards not reproducing and making your country disappear and your own family. Okay, you just have to think, if you want to avoid this scenario, then you have to think, okay, how would individuals and families and societies and countries be organized a little differently so that there would be some chance that we could have as many children as parents? Because right now, the way we're organized, there isn't any. Okay, so what I'm saying is, what I've been driving toward for 50 some episodes is a way to flourish, thrive, and reproduce in the coming era. There is one, probably many, and but first you have to see things clearly for where we are. We are in collapse. We are quickly extinguishing ourselves in amazing, unprecedented ways. Okay, I wish you the best. I hope you have a great week. If you know anybody who would be interested in this content, please encourage them to join in, watch the content, and please keep coming back. Okay, God bless. Take care. Have a great week.